Hello, very beautiful community. As the Ukraine peace plan saga rolls on, I want to expose us to a piece that's quite healthy for us to encounter at this point because it does three things. Number one, it's vehemently pro Ukrainian, but two, it's bleakly realistic about Ukraine's predicament. And three, it expresses one feeling you might have, among others, about European incapacity. In this case, it's moral outrage. The piece is by Jade McGlynn, and some of you will know Jade from interviews, from her articles and her books, Memory Makers and Russia's War. And Jade has a lovely way of being very clear ethically and analytically. And she's got a lovely purity of thought. And purity of thought is not some kind of fascicized reference. It means that it's somebody who doesn't move from A to B until they're fully and clearly confident that B is a place they should be, then they move to B, and from B they can move elsewhere. Now, that's not the only epistemic quality that there is in the world. We can even have some downsides, but it's a quality I have a soft spot for, and we need more of it in our culture, and Jade expresses it in her work and the public communication. So let's read. Amid the absolute chaos of the Witkoff, so this is a Substack, a platform many of you know. Amid the absolute chaos of a Witkoff-stamped Russian psyop as peace plan, discussion is filled with anger at Washington and at Moscow. But the one actor that escapes the level of outrage it actually deserves is Europe. Europe has the most to lose, barring Ukraine, the most responsibility and the fewest excuses. Yet it has chosen paralysis while others determine the fate of our continent. The original proposal read like a boorishly obvious trap designed to weaken Ukraine and prepare for a future war. Yet even that awfulness wasn't enough to garner ringing endorsements from the Kremlin. Putin eventually, and that's true, that plan omitted most of the ambitious aspirations of Mr. Putin that were expressed in the pre-full-scale invasion ultimatum. Putin eventually mustered up a bit of unconvincing enthusiasm. Russian telegram muttered about betrayal and the goals of the special military operation. Since then, Ukraine and the US Secretary of State have decidedly altered the plan, so I imagine the next step is for Russia to reject it. All of which is useful insofar as it solves the immediate problem of this dreadful plan, but it still leaves us with an ever more pressing issue: how to agree a ceasefire that Ukraine really does need. Instead of seriously engaging with that question, the Europeans produced a counter-proposal so weightless it might as well have been crowdsourced on social media. Although that is unfair, Russia should just leave Ukraine, though, is at least as internally consistent as a position. Insisting on Ukrainian sovereignty and then saying Russia should be able to impose an 800,000 troop limit and not 600,000 is just bizarre. Europe is not behaving like a serious geopolitical actor. I think you might say, well, what if a peacetime military personnel limit is imposed on Ukraine that actually exceeds what it can reasonably sustain at peacetime? Is that still a problem? What if the limit wasn't 800,000? What if it was 2 million? What if it was 5 million? And I think the answer to that is that it's still a toxic way of having one's sovereignty undermined. That's going to be a little radioactive in one's political life over time. So if I'm Putin and I'm given the choice between an unpalatable choice either way for Putin, but if I'm Putin, I'm given the choice between unlimited, no ceiling at all on Ukraine's military and a ceiling of 5 million personnel. I'm going to choose the 5 million, even though it's higher than Ukraine could ever generate. It's still an infinitesimal way of inserting an element of toxicity in Ukraine's political life. Now, by the middle of 2023, the signs were already clear that the war was developing according to a different trajectory. Ask yourself that, by the way, in terms of your informational environment, was it clear to you? I remember privately raising questions about what a Ukrainian defeat would mean for Europe. Admittedly, I was doing it because I was hoping that by examining the consequences, European leaders would change their approach. I still hope that. But then those conversations were often dismissed or treated as a kind of political contamination. Policymakers preferred to congratulate themselves for proving Russia wrong about Western fickleness. But Russia was right. Western resolve was exactly as fragile as Moscow believed. Bluntly, even in 2022, we only supported Ukrainians because they fought like heroes from Norse myth and got results. We didn't support them because it was the morally right thing to do. I think support for Ukraine was a blend of, certainly among Western populations, a blend of moral outrage and a kind of authenticity-driven consumerism that gamified war. In the interim, I have struggled to find any deep and serious internal government work on what happens if Ukraine loses. Instead, everybody is busy playing fantasy ceasefire, sometimes with even more absurd questions about post-Ukraine Russia. Like me, European officials are very good at complaining. They complain about Washington, they complain about Kiev, they complain about each other, but complaint ain't policy, action is. Europe refuses to use frozen Russian assets. It refuses to commit to sustain mass-scale financing for Ukrainian defense production. It refuses to engage with viable plans, like even a partial sky shield. It refuses to confront the political costs of real support. The so-called coalition of the willing is willing to do absolutely nothing of any importance. Any importance to bring about a sustainable outcome for Ukraine. Defense budgets rise, in theory, and get spent on nonsense we can only pray will work. Meanwhile, Ukrainian factories, or those unlucky enough not to be fueling the rampant corruption around the office of the president, live hand to mouth. There is continual battlefield innovation that is never scaled, or is scaled only in Russia. Europe needs to deliver massive R&D investments into the only country that knows how to fight, Ukraine. Unfortunately, wars aren't won by issuing statements of concern. Europe is a spectator to its own security. Ukraine desperately needs a ceasefire, but not the ones Russia via Witkoff or not is offering. The country is exhausted. Manpower is worryingly low. Trust in military administration as opposed to the heroes fighting is thin. Everybody hates the territorial recruitment centers that take men from the street. Kiev's internal problems, including serious alleged and proven corruption around the office of the president, make the situation harder. These are all the more reason Europe must step up and apply some muscle, not step back. Meanwhile, Washington is an embarrassing circus. Nobody knows what is going on, and Floridian realtors rewrite treaties and 30-year-long security architecture via the Google Translate function. I've had sympathy for European efforts to court Trump on the assumption that they were buying much-needed time, admittedly after a good decade and a half of ignoring US presidents telling us we were pivoting from Europe. They were pivoting from Europe to develop and implement a strategy. Buy time to develop and implement a strategy. Too much, including Pearl, and has largely been reactive to US whims. Nobody believes in their own charm as much as a Western European diplomat, so perhaps some officials really thought they might win the US around. For the rest, it is probably a more basic case of avoidance dressed up as diplomacy. There is still, in my view, in European corridors of power, a tendency to think that Trump is an aberration, as opposed to think that certain social forces produce Trump, and when Trump is gone, they're going to produce a worse version of Trump, a Trump that is more capable of strategic thought, a Trump that is more disciplined, a Trump that is more effective politically behind closed doors, and isn't just a communicator of genius and not much else. In their talks with Secretary Rubio, the Ukrainians didn't bother discussing the European counterplan, and why should they? Europe has allowed itself to be sidelined to the point where its own security is now being negotiated without it. A better plan is possible, of course, one that protects Ukrainian sovereignty and European security, but it requires Europe to pay actual costs, political, financial, and strategic, and Europe is not willing to do that, or not enough European leaders are. Too many European governments still believe as if losing Ukraine would be unfortunate but manageable. This is a fantasy. The destruction of Ukraine would reshape Europe's security architecture for decades, and not in Europe's favor. Now, of course, the collapse of European security architecture is not just a product of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's also a cause of it. So we've got to be aware that the Russians are not breaking the post-1989 global order as much as they are acting against the background of the collapse of that order. But what you need to understand, I think, here above all, is that there is a connection between domestic policy, democratic incapacity at home, and strategic incapacity on the international stage. The first causes the second, and then the second makes the first worse. And so we're in a kind of vicious loop of domestic incapacity causing foreign incapacity, exacerbating domestic incapacity. It's a very, very difficult loop to break. And breaking that loop politically is like threading something through the eye of a needle. It's possible, but it would be very much a set of exceptional circumstances and a set of exceptional political actors that could do it. In other words, breaking European incapacity even partially is an exceptional rather than a routine move. Nothing about Europe's position today was inevitable. It's the product of decisions not taken, responsibilities avoided, and illusions clung to for too long. It's the product of arrogance, of not realizing Ukraine is the only security guarantee this continent has, and of a bizarre teleological liberalism that sees liberal democracy as somehow fated to win out according to the laws of history. If Europe continues down this path, a settlement will eventually be imposed that reflects the interests of Putin and whichever Americans happen to be influential at that moment. Europe will then complain loudly and indignantly as if it played no part in the outcome. We do not need more European complaints. Europe's problem is not that it lacks options, it's that it refuses to use them. Well, thank you very much, Jade. Let me know how you felt about it. I think that what's important to say is that the Dmitry Witkoff plan, which has outraged most of you, is not too far away from the kind of option for stopping the war that Ukraine is heading for. So it's not some kind of utterly bizarre, disproportionate, aberrant proposal. It's only a little worse than where Ukraine is realistically heading for, if Ukraine is heading for a cessation of the conflict at all. And the only way to change that is to... Sorry, my oxygen machine is misbehaving. The only way to change that is for Europe to enter a different dynamic of support for Ukraine, which is currently not willing or not able. Not willing or not able to enter into. That's a very, very important distinction. It's a distinction that you encounter a lot in your personal lives, right? Is, my relative who is difficult at the Christmas dinner difficult because they won't behave or because they can't behave, right? Are you asking them to do something they can't do? So this won't and can't is a very important distinction. And it's also a very important distinction politically. In what sense is Europe capable of doing what Jade wants it to do? And here what we note is that arguably the West's actions on Ukraine have been more, not less proactive than its actions on other policy issues. Yeah, so stay with that question. Jade's a Brit like me. Is the current UK government with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who has integrity and who is wildly politically lost and has no concept not just of how to communicate, but of the value of communication, is Keir Starmer and his government setting the UK up for a post-truth authoritarian Nigel Farage government because they won't do what they need to do, or because they can't do it? Is centrist technocracy in the UK, which is taking a domestic example, stuck because it can't address itself to the world around it, or because it won't? This is very important. And I think that if you're going to find that the answer is in the middle, then a helpful distinction is between routine and exceptional actions. Are we asking Keir Starmer to do something that is routine, that is failing to do, or are we asking him to do something exceptional, something that is very difficult to do, that most people, most actors in his place wouldn't be able to do and wouldn't even try? But I think that this kind of bleakly realistic, vehemently pro-Ukrainian piece that doesn't sing siren songs about the glory of the latest pronouncement from Kaja Kallas, that kind of perspective is important to you, right? Because you have been exposed over a long time, partly because it's just a product of the pro-Ukrainian algorithmic space, to a lot of content about the imminent collapse of the Russians. You also need to understand that there are prospects of various kinds of collapse in Ukraine, and that what really matters isn't how weak Russia is, or how weak Ukraine is for that matter, but the relative set of strengths and weaknesses of the two sides. And from that point of view, both sides are losing the war, but as Mark Galeotti likes to say, one side, Ukraine, is losing it more rapidly. So thank you for sharing this with me. Now, the question that arises in your minds is, well, what the hell can we do about this? Is there anything more to this than just people in positions of power waking up and beginning to get it more? I think that matters, but I think it's marginal, because you're not going to get progress on this simply on the back of willpower. Because I think the core obstructive force here is democratic incapacity at home. And so the very rough equation is European support for Ukraine can get better if European democracies strengthen themselves. Ukraine will, however, likely get less support if European democracies weaken, and indeed if they progress to elect post-truth authoritarian populists who are going to be organically, not in virtue of some kind of malign foreign interference, although that might have a small role too, but they're going to be organically aligned with Moscow, right? So part of the problem with this story about European incapacity is that we are becoming like Russia a little bit, because there's so many ways in which Russia is unique, but there are more ways in which Russia is not unique at all, but is just an extreme manifestation of global forces that are affecting all of us. Right? So part of the reason, speaking cartoonishly, that we're not helping Ukraine more is that we're becoming a bit like Russia. We're going to be more like Russia 5 years from now, and even more like Russia 10 years from now. And this is going to lead to a predicament where, by the 2040s, several West European democracies may have collapsed. We're not going to have societal collapse, we're going to have democratic collapse. What's positive to be said about this? What's positive to be said about this is that this is all a matter of degree. None of this is either or. Things can always go 1 degree worse or 1 degree better. And when things go 1 degree better democratically, things go 1 degree better on the foreign stage, and things go 1 degree better for Ukraine. And 1 degree means a lot. It means different gradations of sovereignty. It means different gradations of us in Europe maintaining some control against the Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance that's pressing to take over our security arrangements. You could also have degrees of lives being saved and so on. So just because there's what we might call an historical tendency that we can't just sort of flatly knock out and reverse, doesn't mean it's pointless to do anything. Because each degree of progress or each degree of avoidance of a further slide makes concrete political difference. And it's the responsibility of efficacious citizens to be alert to these differences and be alert to which kinds of political actors are going to make things worse and which kind of political actors are going to make things better. Now, inevitably we culminated in a rant here, but I hope this dose of indignant realism from Jade was of use. Lots of love and talk soon.